Today I'll be showing you how I created this bumblebee using coloured pencils and powder blender. Hi there, my name is Michelle Cashmore, and today's coloured pencil demonstration will be a little different to the ones that I've done in the past. For this piece, instead of my usual odorless mineral spirits, I used a product called Powder Blender to blend. This is produced by a company called Brush and Pencil, and they have a number of different related products. The powder blender itself, which is applied with a sponge to blend the pencil, 2 aerosol sprays, one for a working fixative and one for a final fixative, and also liquid touch-up texture and titanium white pigment powder. I used the 2 aerosol sprays and the powder blender itself for this particular piece, although I do find the other ones useful as well. For coloured pencil pieces that use powder blender, you can't use watercolour paper as it's too absorbent and flexible. The Brush and Pencil company recommend using either sanded paper or gessoed paper. I chose to take the easier approach and use sanded paper that I mounted onto a panel. The sanded paper was an interesting paper to work with. It really felt like the paper chewed through the pencils very quickly, but it was just really that so much pigment was able to get onto the paper so quickly. It was definitely an interesting learning experience for me, one that I really enjoyed, and I'll be sure to use more of this in the future. Now let's move on to the video itself. So here I'm starting off with the background and laying in colour very roughly. Normally with coloured pencils you have to work with a very sharp point and use very small circles just to lay in colour as evenly as possible, but with the powder blender you don't have to do that. As you can see, I'm using the side of the pencil here, and it all looks very rough, but the application of the blender will smooth it all out really well. Once my first layer's in, I use what's called a Sofft tool from Castell, which has a little sponge applicator on the end, to apply a small amount of the powder blender to the coloured pencil. You only need a tiny amount, but you can see how well it's smoothing out the pencil. Now it's not visible on the video here, but after I applied that layer of powder blender, I then used the workable fixative spray to fix that layer before applying my next layer. If you don't spray the fixative in between layers, then it can be quite hard to get the vibrancy of colour that I'm going for, as previous layers can start to lift up as you apply more pencil over the top. So using the workable fixative between layers is really important. The powder blender products apparently work better with more oil-based pencils, so for this piece I stuck to my Polychromos mostly, with a few pablos pencils thrown in. I avoided using the luminance ones as they're quite waxy pencils. So I'm on to my third layer of the background now, and I'm really trying to build up that out of focus look. You can also see that I'm starting to get a really rich dark green down at the bottom of the piece, which is what I was going for. Now because I'm working on sanded paper, this method does produce quite a bit more pencil dust and chews through the pencil, or it feels like you're chewing through the pencils quite a lot more than usual, but it's just because a lot more pigment is being deposited onto the paper much quicker. I found keeping a paper towel underneath my piece helped collect up the worst of the dust. That piece of transparent paper under my hand is glassine paper, and I use it to avoid smudging my piece as I work. Once I'm done with my background, I move on to the foreground subjects. Now I'm working with much sharper pencils here as I want to capture a lot more detail in the foreground flowers. There's also a lot of white in this piece as it's very brightly sunlit, so I'm making good use of a white pablo pencil. As you can see on the sanded paper, the white pencil really shows up. It's very opaque and can actually cover other colours over very easily, which is quite different to the way that coloured pencils normally work when using watercolour paper and odorless mineral spirits. Another difference that I found when using sanded paper is that the colours of the pencils appear much darker than they would normally. Again, this is because so much pigment is being deposited onto the paper. So I found that I frequently had to knock back some of the blues and purples with the white just to give it a bit more of a paler colour. When I'm blending, I'm also using a much more pointed sponge. That really allows me to just blend out small little details rather than going over the whole thing, which would smudge it out far more than I would like. Now that I'm onto the bee, you can see that I'm not using straight black on the black sections of the bumblebee. I'm first of all putting down layers of a reddish brown colour. This just helps to give it a richer undertone and gives it a bit more life than just using straight black. For the wings, I'm first of all mapping out the veins and then applying the colour for the membranes. This just allows me to keep my place, as otherwise the pigment would cover up my pencil marks. As always, I'm paying close attention to my reference photo and checking what the colours actually are on the wings rather than what I think I see. For example, here the yellow stripes are actually slightly visible through the wings, but they're not just yellow, there's grey tones on top of that. The reference photo I used for this piece was actually one that I took myself some years ago at a local nature reserve just a few miles down the road from me. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I've always just loved how vivid and bright the colours were on this photo. Because I can get the detail almost straight away on the foreground, I actually found that I needed a lot less layers for the flower and the bee than I did for the background itself, mainly because I didn't need to do nearly so much blending. The blending process does lift a bit of colour, so I did find myself having to go back and reapply more often during the background. Because there's so much detail in the flower, I did find it quite hard to follow along what was happening at some points. When this happened, I was just very careful to pay very close attention to my reference photo and try to just paint the shapes that I saw rather than picturing it as a flower in my head. It makes it much easier to draw or paint what you see if you just focus on the almost abstract shapes. There are some details that I'm leaving out at this stage. The pods and stem of the flower have a lot of very fine hairs, which I'm leaving out at this point. The plan is for me to go back and add those in once I've finished the first layer of the flower, given it a spray of workable fixative, and then I can go back and do absolute final details at the end on a new layer. While I didn't have the exact colour I was looking for in one particular pencil, particularly for the flowers, I found that it was pretty easy to blend to get the colour that I wanted. So I ended up blending lots of blues, purples and pinks on the flowers, and then later on the flower stem, blending various greens and greys and creams to get the exact colour that I was looking for. There is no perfect colour in any case. What's more important is getting your lights where they need to be and your darks where they need to be. So getting the values correct, in other words. If those are correct within a painting, then colours being slightly different to the reference photo won't make nearly as big of an impact. I'm usually not too worried about getting an absolutely perfect colour, as long as my values are where I want them to be. I'm just continuing the same process around the rest of the painting, so blocking in my colours, blending them out just a little bit with a small blender, and sometimes touching up again where appropriate. At this point, when I'm touching up, I found I didn't need to spray the entire piece with workable fixative. As long as I wasn't making too many changes over the top, then the second layer was okay. However, as I mentioned earlier, I will be doing a spray of workable fixative over the first layer before doing absolute final details. I did find that using the brush and pencil fixative sprays did require a little bit of extra management to avoid them from having a tendency to splatter. Now, if the sprays do splatter, it's not the end of the world, as you can just apply pencil over the top of them and that will cover it up. But in order to minimise it, I found that the best things to do were to ensure that the nozzle was rinsed in warm water and dried before using the can. So the nozzles just pull off and you can clean them out and then put them back on again. The other thing that I found as well is to shake the can really well. Like, give it a good several minutes shaking, just to make sure that it was mixed thoroughly. And finally, to start the spray and end the spray outside the drawing, so go in horizontal motions and start before reaching the drawing and go over top and past it. So here I've completed the first pass over the flower and the bee, sprayed it with workable fixative, and now I'm coming back and tidying up those edges, applying fine lines and just really finishing off all the little details for the piece. These final touches just really help to make it look polished and complete. I really enjoyed working with the sanded paper and powder blender for coloured pencils. It's very different to my normal way of working with them, but I really enjoyed it. There was definitely a learning curve to this piece, but I'm looking forward to trying more again in the future. And that is it for this video. I do hope you found it useful. If you've enjoyed it and would like to see more of my work, then please do subscribe. You can find me at my website, michellcashmoreart.com. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you're interested in purchasing prints of my artwork, then you can find these at Fine Art America and Pixels.com. Hope to see you again soon, and thanks for watching.